Welcome back to Notes of Curiosity, exploring ideas that matter. Hey everyone, Alex here, and I'm joined today by Eve. And we're going to be diving into a really fascinating year, 1945, the year that most people just think of as pure victory.
But as we're going to see, the victory came with a lot of complexities, a lot of euphoria, but also a lot of disillusionment, and really some profound shifts in society.
And the book that's going to guide us through all of this is Year Zero, 1945 by Ian Buruma.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is so compelling about this book is that Buruma, who was born in 1951, actually uses his own father's experience during World War II as a way to explore these broader themes of this really pivotal year.
Yeah, his father's story is incredible. He was a Dutch student who was forced into labor in Germany during the war, and he might have even witnessed Jewish people being hidden in the factory where he was working. He survived the bombing of Berlin, barely escaped execution by Soviet soldiers, and then ultimately he was able to return to the Netherlands.
So using this really personal lens, Buruma examines how the world grappled with the aftermath of this absolutely devastating conflict, not just physically, but psychologically, too.
Yeah. So our mission in this deep dive is to really understand how 1945 shaped the world that we live in today. What were the unexpected consequences of liberation beyond, those initial celebrations?
Yeah.
How did societies rebuild from the ashes of the war?
And one of the key insights that Buruma offers is that liberation wasn't a uniform experience. Western nations, they were rejoicing in victory, but for many people, 1945 was just the beginning of a whole new chapter of uncertainty, even chaos.
Yeah, and he even contrasts his own mother's reaction, which was rather subdued to the victory in Europe with kind of the more exuberant celebrations that were happening around her.
Right.
He writes, "My mother, the daughter of immigrants, had adopted the typically British wartime response to good news. Plant another row of beans. We don't do victory," she would say.
Yeah, it's this subtle but really powerful reminder that even in the midst of this widespread joy, there were these undercurrents of anxiety, of personal loss, and the weight of a world that had been irrevocably changed.
And for many women in particular, especially in occupied countries, liberation took on a very different dimension. And Buruma explores how relationships with Allied soldiers became a source of solace, comfort, and even opportunity.
Yeah, he really brings this to life through the experiences of Benoit Groot, who was a French novelist. And she describes so vividly the allure of American soldiers, their music, their lifestyle. She says, "To sleep with an American soldier at that time was a little like being with a whole continent."
Wow. Yeah, it's a fascinating glimpse into how liberation really intertwined with these personal desires and escapism and even this sense of rebellion against the constraints of wartime society.
Right, and this dynamic wasn't limited to just France. Buruma highlights how these fraternization policies emerged, sometimes officially sanctioned, sometimes just tacitly accepted, as Allied soldiers were interacting with the local populations.
In the Netherlands, Princess Juliana and Prince Bernhard even established an entertainment committee to specifically connect English-speaking Dutch women with Canadian soldiers.
Huh.
But this wasn't always, such a lighthearted affair, right?
Unfortunately, no. While in Western Europe, a lot of these relationships were consensual, under Soviet occupation, things took a much darker turn.
Right.
Buruma talks about an anonymous diary of a Berlin woman who enters into a relationship with a Soviet officer. And she does this not out of choice, but as a means of protection from the rampant sexual violence that was happening under the Soviet occupation.
It's a stark reminder that liberation often came at a really high price, and that the lines between victim and perpetrator, liberator and oppressor could get really blurred in the chaotic aftermath of war.
Yeah, and this blurring of moral lines also extended to the issue of collaboration. Bruma's own father, when he returned to his student fraternity, he found himself witnessing these hazing rituals that were directed at fellow students, including some who had been Holocaust survivors.
Wow, that's a chilling example of how societies grappled with the moral complexities of wartime, trying to restore a sense of normalcy while also harboring really deep wounds and unresolved traumas.
Right, and this desire for normalcy often came at the expense of those who were deemed to have transgressed these wartime norms. Women who had relationships with German soldiers during the occupation, who were labeled horizontal collaborators, faced really harsh social consequences, even if their actions were driven by survival.
So we see this intricate web of choices and compromises and consequences that were playing out in the lives of individuals as they were trying to navigate this world that had been completely turned upside down.
Yeah, absolutely.
So welcome back to our deep dive into Year Zero, 1945. We've been talking about the complexities of liberation, but I'm really curious to dig more into the long-term impacts of that year. because it seems like 1945 also really marked the beginning of this huge cultural shift, particularly with the growing influence of America.
Oh, absolutely. And Buruma really argues that the Americanization of both Germany and Japan, although it happened in different ways, it really takes root in this period. He writes, American consumer goods, fashions, and above all, American popular music came to symbolize not just liberation, but modernity itself.
But this cultural exchange, as we were discussing earlier, it wasn't always welcomed. It happened against this backdrop of racial tensions and anxiety.
Exactly right. And he even points to the derogatory terms that were used to describe women who associated with Allied soldiers.
No.
In Germany, they were called Schokoladweibern or
Mhm.
chocolate women. And then in Japan, there were these fears about racial mixing. There were anxieties about this threat to cultural purity.
And Buruma shares this really insightful observation from the Japanese novelist Sakunosuke Oda. And he writes, Oda noted how American soldiers did not, in fact, resemble the emaciated, long-nosed, blonde, blue-eyed Anglo-Saxon devils depicted in wartime propaganda. This, he thought, was a relief.
That's such a fascinating point because the reality of encountering the enemy as liberators really challenged those narratives that had been so carefully constructed during the war.
Yeah, so how did this Americanization actually manifest in kind of everyday life?
Well, think about all of the things that had been suppressed under the previous regimes. Jazz music, Hollywood films, even chewing gum. All of these things became symbols of freedom, of modernity, and a rejection of that wartime past.
So in a sense, embracing American culture almost became a way of moving forward,
Yeah.
embracing this new world order that was emerging.
Precisely. And it's important to remember that this wasn't just a top-down imposition. A lot of people genuinely embraced these cultural imports. But of course, there was resistance too. There was the sense that some people were selling out or that they were losing their national identity.
Yeah, and it seems like this tension between kind of embracing the new and holding on to the past, that's a recurring theme throughout Baruma's book.
It really is. And it's especially evident in the way that women's roles were changing. With men away at war, women had entered the workforce, they had experienced new freedoms, and this really challenged the very fabric of these patriarchal societies. Buruma states, the war had emancipated many women. This did not mean that all of them wanted to be emancipated, but the fact was that the old order of fathers and husbands in charge had been shaken.
So liberation, in a way, had this unintended consequence of disrupting traditional gender roles and expectations.
Yeah, and this disruption really played out in different ways across different cultures. In Japan, for example, the American occupiers actually encouraged certain aspects of women's liberation because they saw it as a way to modernize and democratize Japanese society.
It's almost as if the war created this ripple effect that led to these really significant social and cultural changes that went way beyond just ending the conflict itself.
Right, and that brings us back to Buruma's central question, which is, how do you rebuild not just the physical infrastructure, but the mindsets, the social norms, and even national identities after this kind of devastation?
It's a question that feels so relevant even today as we grapple with the legacies of conflict, the challenges of globalization, and even just this ongoing search for identity in a world that is constantly changing.
Yeah. And in the final part of our deep dive, we're going to explore how some of the themes and insights from Year Zero connect to our present moment and offer some really valuable lessons for how we navigate the complexities of our own time.
And we're back for our final part of this deep dive into Ian Buruma's Year Zero, 1945. We've covered so much from, the complexities of liberation to the rise of American influence, but I think what's really stayed with me is this idea that Buruma puts forward that this one year laid the groundwork for so much of what we see happening in the world today.
Yeah, it's true. Buruma really argues that, the anxieties and the ideals, the choices that people made in 1945, they continue to kind of reverberate through history, shaping the geopolitical landscape that we see, the cultural trends, even, the personal struggles that we're still grappling with.
So what are some of the most striking kind of echoes of Year Zero that we see in our present moment?
Well, one that immediately jumps out, I think, is the rise of these new global powers. Buruma reminds us that 1945 really saw the United States step onto the world stage as this superpower. And that influence, for better or for worse, has really shaped, international relations ever since.
Yeah, and we've talked about the Americanization of Germany and Japan, but it sounds like that was really just the beginning. Buruma suggests that American culture, its music, its movies, even its consumerism really became this global force in the post-war world.
Yeah, and he even goes as far as to say that the American century, that term that was coined back then, was really in a lot of ways born out of the ashes of World War II. And I mean, we see that legacy playing out today and everything
Hmm.
from, the global reach of Hollywood to the prevalence of American brands and products all around the world.
But as we discussed, that cultural dominance, it wasn't without its critics.
Right.
There was a backlash. There was this feeling that certain cultures were being overwhelmed or even erased by this wave of American influence.
Absolutely. And that raises a question I think that's still so relevant for us today, which is how do we navigate cultural exchange in a way that's respectful and reciprocal, in a way that avoids kind of the pitfalls of cultural homogenization? It's a question that we see playing out in so many debates, about globalization and the influence of social media and the preservation of cultural diversity.
Another echo of year zero that feels especially relevant right now is this persistent threat of conflict. I mean, we haven't seen another world war on that scale, thankfully, but Buruma reminds us that the seeds of future conflict were really sown in the aftermath of 1945.
Right. He points to the rise of the Cold War, the division of Europe, and the emergence of all these new ideological battles. And the fact that so many of those tensions and resentments never really went away, they just kind of went underground.
Yeah, even as institutions like the United Nations were being created to promote, international cooperation and peace, those efforts often felt overshadowed by just this looming threat of conflict, that mistrust and that competition for power that just continued beneath the surface.
And sadly, we're still dealing with that legacy today. I mean, we see it in the resurgence of nationalism and the rise of these authoritarian leaders who exploit those old divisions, and in all these ongoing conflicts that seem almost impossible to resolve. It's almost like they're fueled by, the ghosts of the past.
It's a pretty sobering reminder that achieving lasting peace really takes more than just signing treaties or, ending wars. You have to address the root causes of those conflicts, the inequalities, the injustices, and the ideologies that are driving people apart.
And I think that's really where Broom's book is so valuable. He doesn't just focus on those grand narratives of history or these geopolitical shifts. He brings it down to the human level, to the stories of individuals who are just trying to rebuild their lives amidst all the devastation and the ruins of war.
Yeah, we encounter, refugees who are fleeing their homelands. We see families that have been torn apart by displacement and individuals who are wrestling with, trauma and loss
Yeah.
and this desire to find some meaning
Yeah.
in a world that's been completely shattered.
And their stories, while they're often incredibly heartbreaking, they also reveal this just incredible resilience of the human spirit, the capacity for hope, for love, and for rebuilding even when they're facing, unimaginable suffering.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into year zero, what's the one thing you want our listener to take away from this book? Why should they care about this year that seems so distant now and, its impact on us today?
I think Buruma really drives home the point that history is so much more than just dates and facts. It's this living force that continues to shape who we are, the world we live in, and the choices that we make every day. And by understanding the anxieties and the ideals and the mistakes and even the triumphs of 1945, I think we gain a much deeper understanding of the challenges that we face today.
It's almost like holding up a mirror to our own time, right? Seeing those echoes of the past in our own present day, struggles with conflict and with cultural change, with the search for identity and belonging.
Exactly. And Buruma, he doesn't offer any easy answers or simple solutions, but I think he gives us a framework for thinking critically, for questioning assumptions, and for recognizing just how interconnected history and our own lives really are.
So to our listeners, if you're looking for a book that will make you think and challenge your assumptions and ultimately leave you with a deeper understanding of just how complex our world really is, I can't recommend Year Zero, 1945, enough.
It's really a journey through this pivotal year in history, a year that continues to shape our present and will undoubtedly continue to influence our future. And as you read it, I think it's so important to ask yourself, what lessons can we learn from the past? How can we use those lessons to build a better future? And ultimately, what does year zero mean to you?
That's all the time we have for this deep dive. Eve, it's been a pleasure exploring this book with you.
Likewise, Alex.
And to our listeners, we hope that this has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to keep exploring the past and its relevance to our present. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.